privacy today no longer exists. Take a look behind the scenes of the internet, and you'll see a great surveillance engine, which is continuously amalgamating billions of data points on all of us. Surveillance today is no longer solely the business of states. The web in its totality is today driven by the collection of personal data.
Well, we didn't mean to scare you, but we're about to scare you, maybe. We're talking about privacy and the fact that it may have completely disappeared, and maybe trying to look for solutions as we continue to live in the digital world. This is our BT panel. We've got lots of people to get to. First, we've got Alain Ghiai. He's the CEO of GlobeX Data Limited. We've got Jean-Philippe Descaries-Mathieu, who's been on the show before and really scared me the last time he was here. The head of cybersecurity commissionaire du Québec. We've got Alexander Shelder, who's the director of that film there that you saw, Hack MTL. And Mourad, am I saying this? Debabi, yes. Research Chair, Concordia Institute for Information System Engineering. Guys, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I mentioned off the top that we may be scaring the people at home. First, the big question is privacy dead? Who wants to jump in?
I will.
Yeah, you will. You're the man who scared me last time.
I'm the party pooper here. Yeah. So I'm, in many ways it is, or at least the way we conceive privacy growing up, because we're all pretty much in sort of same range of age, it dramatically changed. Right now, personal information is a commodity used by large businesses, and it's a very lucrative market. So as long as it stays lucrative, I mean, there's little hope of reclaiming privacy as a fundamental right, or at least the way we conceived it originally.
Well, Alex, I want you to get your opinion on this, because this movie, is one of these things that you watch and you go, I was just telling you that I finished watching and I wanted to go and erase everything. Mm-hmm. Is it even possible once it's out there to bring anything back?
Well, you were giving the example of how for you it's necessary for your work, and as a documentary filmmaker, I use social media for research purposes a lot, to contact characters that I want in my movies, and this raises the idea that these companies have been able to put themselves at the core of the way our societies and economies work in their normal fashion, so it's becoming harder and harder to pull yourself out of there.
So can we opt out?
Well, if you use social media, you cannot. But, for example, if you store corporate or personal data in a country with very heavy privacy laws, like Switzerland, where I am from, and where our company stores our data and everybody else's, then yes, you could have some privacy.
But Monsieur and Madame Tout le Monde don't have access.
Monsieur and Madame Tout le Monde don't, I mean, they could, but they typically don't. You have to pay extra. Obviously, the idea is that if you want to have something for free, you will have no privacy.
Yeah.
If you want privacy, you'll have to pay for it. And even then, depending on each international jurisdiction of data residency laws, you may or may not have that privacy that you think.
But that's interesting, because that brings up, that's not new, right? Secrets are for the rich. They've always been for the rich. If you can afford to hide it, you'll hide it. So now we're officially saying that privacy is for the wealthy?
Well, I'm going to counter that. You can be very wealthy in the U.S. and still have the Patriot Act apply on you.
Okay.
Or I think it was Bill C-59 in Canada that opened up that as well. So it's a matter of where you live and where your data resides. I would say where the data resides, with the strictest privacy laws, wherever you could find them, then yes, that's where that's where you have the most protection, at least.
Mourad, I want to get you to jump in and maybe sort of explain to me, I mean, you can in the little time that we have, but sort of take us through how we got to this point and who you think the scariest actors or bad guys are that we should be looking out for. Because if you don't have the money to be able to hide or protect yourself in Switzerland, people are watching at home and saying, what do I do?
Well,
because you're an optimist. You told me you're an optimist.
I am, actually. I think we are in the beginning, and there's a lot of movement in this area, in privacy. There is legislation that are coming out. There is a lot of discussion taking place. There's a lot of research on privacy-enhancing technologies. And I believe with time, if we give it some more time, we will have more technologies that allow people to interact on the internet without releasing that much information. At the same time, it will be putting some requirements of compliance, privacy requirements, that companies cannot do whatever. They have to protect.
But, okay, they have to protect, but look at what happened in Desjardins. Look what happened at Capital One. We are consumers. We potentially, maybe we're blind and we just hope and we suppose that these financial institutions have all of this set up for us. So is it putting the onus on the consumer? Like, what am I supposed to do to make sure that Desjardins doesn't have this happen again? Is that even possible?
Well, I just want to interject here. Desjardins is a specific case of insider threat exfiltrating information. There's not a single...
But we don't know where everything went, though. We still don't know.
That's correct. That's correct. But I mean, it's not so much of a regulation or a compliance issue in this case. It's insider threat is a threat that all businesses face in some ways or another.
It's like a rogue thing.
It's a wild card basically. So there's no perfect way to protect ourselves against it.
So that can happen again. We're saying that's not.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
expect it to happen again. Actually.
Expect it to happen again.
Oh, sure.
Yes, it happens on a daily basis. I think you have two things happening. You have the social media and people's data being used as a commodity to make money by corporation. And you do have regulation now, especially in Europe now, they're punishing those large companies with fines. I have a crazy idea. If Google is going to want to make money or Facebook on me by reselling my data, I should get a share of the revenue.
Well, try to convince Google to give you anything.
The government can legislate such laws because you have the commercial aspect and you have the legal aspect. And then you have this kind of insider threat. So what we're talking about here is that there should be bigger fines because companies only understand what costs in their pocket.
Money.
That's it.
Agreeing.
At the end of the day, it boils down to that. And they do own government and they do elect governments.
Yeah.
So one thing is a commercial aspect. The other one is a whole ethical or legal aspect.
So, Alain, you were just telling me that we're all tools, right? In both senses of the word.
In both senses of the word. So, for example, we are a product. What happens is that when we do accept to use the big products out there, the Googles, the Amazons, etc., our data is essentially valuable to them. And we were talking earlier about fossil fuel and commodity. Data now is more valuable than oil.
Data is more valuable than oil.
We just surpassed the value.
Wow.
And what's even worse is that oil is going to be eventually extinct. But data, we create data. We are creating unlimited amount of resources, never ending, for these big companies that, again, they could care less if they pay a couple billions in fine.
Right. Do you sleep at night? Because this really just scared me as well.
I sleep because all my data is in Switzerland.
There you go. All his data is in Switzerland. But, Alex, you did mention, we were talking about how quickly we adapt, right? So we were talking about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about fossil fuels and how societies have to organize themselves around anything new.
Yeah, for me, the comparison to fossil fuels is a really strong one. When we started organizing our societies and our economies around this new technology of, like, burning fossil fuels, we didn't foresee that in 50 years or 60 years we would be faced with, like, a massive collective problem.
Yes.
And now legislation is very hard. It's hard to create legislation to address this issue.
It's slow to catch up.
Well, because it's central to the way our societies work. And what we're doing right now with data-driven technologies and data-driven economy is we are putting a new technology at the center of how societies function. It's becoming increasingly difficult to live without a smartphone, to live without a...
I noticed that I'm the only one with a smartphone on the table. You guys are...
Oh, but we all have it in our pockets.
In your pockets, in your pockets.
All of us have it on. It's fully charged. So and we are emitting data through apps that we didn't read the terms and conditions of, and so on. So,
let's talk about that.
Yeah.
You were going to say something.
I think the problem is beyond data that we use on social networks or Facebook or Google and so on. I think data nowadays is used in this building, for example, for controlling the building. Data is used in transportation systems. Data is used to control...
The so-called smart homes now. Yeah.
Smart homes, smart grids, smart cities, smart buildings, and on a daily basis. I see a lot of collection of data on these buildings, on this infrastructure, and so on. So I think the events that are happening nowadays, the leaks, the attacks, and so on, will accelerate the legislation work.
Will accelerate the legislation.
Will accelerate the enforcement.
But in time, do you think?
I think I'm optimistic, honestly. I think we, by our nature, we are reactive, right? When we see things, worse things happening, then we start to immediately react. And I think privacy and security are gaining much more traction and attention from government, from organizations.
Well, government, we have to say yes, because if we look at what happened with the elections in the States, what's happening here, I mean, this is now, privacy is linked to our democracy. It's linked to the information we get. It's hacking elections. It's creating division. And then I sent to you, I asked you, all of you, during the commercial break, I said, you know, who's the big bad guy? Is it the Russians? And you all said Google.
It's Google and all the other big companies collecting your data.
Right.
So I have a question for that. Like, what kind of legislation can address Google?
Yeah.
Like a global
aren't they too
company
big to
like
touch?
I think right now, for example, if you take corporations, they have compliance requirements, for example, financial institutions. But compliance requirement doesn't allow them to, doesn't require them to protect data that they have. We mentioned the example of Desjardins. So it was an insider threat, yes, but don't you have access control policies? Don't you have shared credentials?
I think that's what surprised everyone, that
Yes,
sort
it
of
should be
one
protected.
person or a
The
group
data-
of people could do that. Maybe you want to jump in on this. Why was it so easy?
I don't have any information on how that particular case, the function, the security policies of Desjardins, I don't know them. And so it's very hard for me to comment on this specifically. And usually big businesses do have, they're ISO 27001 compliant and PCI DSS compliant if they want to sell
Murad's
stuff.
shaking his head. He's not buying it.
I agree, it's not enough.
Yeah.
I agree, it's not enough. But the thing is, I think I have not as much faith in legislators as you guys, because.
So what do you think will change it, though?
Well, I mean,
you're not very optimistic. That's why we separated the two of you.
I think Murad was right saying that we as a human being, as a human race, we react most of the time, but we have to define immediately how do we react immediately. I mean, of all the legislators in Canada right now, how many do understand the root of the problem? I would say that they probably could count them on one hand, you know, and they face a lot of pressure from that industry also, and some of them, like I said, are bought for by those businesses. And if Facebook can actually budget a $5 billion fine and go on, I mean, how much impact does the government really have? I mean, will they have impact in 15 years when their whole business model has changed?
Yeah.
I think we're putting too much emphasis on the government, both them being the bad guys, because I believe they're not in many ways. It's more about the corporations, and it goes right back to how much does it cost to. You have regulation, but you have to implement.
$5 billion, though.
No, but let's say a regular company. I'm on Murad's camp because I deal with tons of companies and governments. So what we do is we want to see, are you implementing that policy? Are you implementing that law? It always goes back to implementing.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
But speaking of hackers and your film, so the hackers are, you know, the hackers used to be the bad guys, and then they showed us that now they're the nice guys. So is that the future?
They never were the bad guys.
They know. There you go. So are they going to be the ones to at least help us out in the end? Is everyone? Are we resting our hopes on?
Murad mentioned privacy-enhancing technologies, so there's a whole, group of hackers who are really involved in developing what are called privacy-enhancing technologies. The most well-known of those is the Tor network, or the Tor browser, which is in the documentary. And so there is a lot of initiative coming from the free and open source software community.
But it's not moving as fast as the rest of us are hitting on accept. We hit accept on those terms, and we've accepted it all.
Tor is sponsored by the State Department, too, if you look at their sponsors.
Hey, boy.
So I'm not sure how independent they are. I've heard about Tor for years.
Well, you guys will have to come back to talk about Tor, because you have to watch this documentary, by the way, Hack MTL.
On Canal D, September 5th.
On Canal D, September 5th. And we didn't mean to scare you. We'll have to have them back to continue to figure out. But I guess no one's really reading those terms. They were hitting accept. Okay, all right.